Today's Bible study is going to be an overview on the book of Judges. I have just finished the entire book of Judges, week by week, chapter by chapter. If you haven't seen it, I will link it on the screen so you can check out that playlist. Usually at the end of those, I will do a recap video on that entire book of the Bible. So that's what we're doing today. So my study resources for this video, not only did I use the resources that I used all along, so if you watch any of those videos, anything that I mentioned in any of those past videos for each individual chapter, but also for today, I used the Bible Project. It was really helpful in preparing for this overview. So Judges picks up right after the death of Joshua. And we know that with Joshua, he led Israel partway, he led Israel to the promised land. And before Joshua, there was Moses. And so Israel, they were very inclined to want a leader, a king, if you will. They kept asking God for that instead of putting God as their leader, right? As we are to put God as our leader in our lives. They wanted a leader so bad. And so Judges is not like a judge if we think about it today, but rather it was several leaders that Israel had before they had a king. God raised up different people. And it starts off, with the leaders being good, and it gets progressively worse. And we'll learn of Israel's constant cycle of rejecting God, running into turmoil, learning from their mistakes, accepting God back into their hearts, and then starting the process all over again. So with Judges, we know of Joshua's death, and Israel was warned by God many times not to follow the practices of other lands. It's not like they didn't know. And one takeaway that I get from that piece of information is sometimes God gives us, not sometimes, let me reframe that, re-say that. God gives us his word, and we know there's so many things in our word that he cautions us from doing, yet sometimes we do it anyway. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Take that as a warning. Heed his instruction and listen to the things that he is telling us to do. In Judges 1 and 2, we learn that God instructed Israel to completely drive the Canaanites out of the land, and Israel did not obey. So my takeaway from that is, of course, we know that partial obedience is still disobedience. You can't partially obey God. We have to obey him fully. We can't say, well, I'm going to honor God in this way, but in this other way, which he has also instructed me to do, that's hard for me. I'm not going to do that, or I'm working on it. Or sometimes we tend to make excuses for ourselves. And while, yes, we are human and things happen, that doesn't mean that we can't live a life of excellence, especially when it comes to our walk with God. And the fact that the Canaanites stayed in the land partially had a lot of influence on Israel and how they behaved. And like I mentioned before, they ended up in a cycle. With this cycle, it would start with Israel sinning. Then God will allow Israel to be conquered by the Canaanites. Israel repents. God raises up a judge. Oppressors are defeated. There's peace in the land. And then Israel would sin again, and they would fall into this really vicious cycle. It was extremely unhealthy. And now when we think about the six major judges, at least throughout the book, it starts, like I mentioned before, with good, and then it ends with not so good. So the six judges include Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. And again, if you go through this series with me, then you'll learn about each person individually. It went from good to not so good. I mean, the intention was there, especially with Samson and, with the not so good. These people had good intentions, but they didn't obey God fully, which is something that unfortunately is repeated throughout the book of Judges. It shows us that we can't live our lives like that, even today. In Judges 17 through 18, we read about Micah and how he makes his own temple and his own priest, and a city is destroyed. And then in chapters 19 through 21, we read about abuse, murder, war, dismemberment, like really awful things that are very heinous. And honestly, it was really hard to read. But as a main takeaway here, heed God's warnings. What we do now, it may impact others for future generations. You see that these people, they were stuck in a cycle, just an endless cycle that we talked about earlier. Practice full obedience. Partial obedience is disobedience. Don't feel like you can only, and I know I've shared it in the past few weeks especially, just a few videos on doing the hard thing when it comes to our walk with Christ, submitting to our spouse as wives fully in every way. Partial obedience is disobedience. Loving others, forgiveness, all of the things that I talk about or try to on this channel pretty regularly. We have to remember that we are called to fully obey, not partially obey, and heed the warning of these people here so that you don't make the same mistakes in your life. So that's just a really brief overview on the book of Judges. I hope it was helpful for you. I post a new Bible study video on Wednesdays and Fridays at 7 a.m. Eastern, and I can't wait to study the Bible with you again.